is so we had three questions on the table. What is folklore? How is it fundamental for the African oral tradition? What is your personal experiences with folklore? And then how is your experience reading the text and what questions you have? So, who would like to provide us with a working definition of what was discussed as far as what folklore is? Go ahead, I'll say.
Folklore can be like multiple things. It can be culture or it can be oral, like stories or tales, I believe.
Yep, absolutely. Why do you think it's fundamental or important for the African oral tradition?
Because for the African or like there could be many stories. Like the story that we read today, like the one we're gonna read today, is like man versus animals, like humanity versus like the society or the animal kingdom. So I believe like that could have multiple meanings to it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone have any personal experiences with folklore? Is there a folklore that your family tells, your community tells, or your culture at large tells? Any experiences with folklore? Go ahead, I say.
Um, one of my folklores, my family would tell me, my mom grew up in Mexico.
Mhm.
So one would be like the kukui is like an animal being, like not an animal, but like a being that will take and kidnap bad kids. So my mom would like threaten me. She's like, you know what, if you don't like if you don't behave, the kukui is gonna come get you.
Yep.
So I'm like, okay, like I have to behave now. Like I don't want to get kidnapped.
Right.
That's one of the folklores.
That's a perfect depiction of a folklore and how the folklore is used and what the work of the folklore could do. Who would like to discuss, besides Alice? Thank you for your participation, Alice. Who would like to discuss how their experience was reading the text? Was it difficult? Was like the wording and the phrasing hard for them to digest? And then what questions they may have about the text?
I could go.
Okay.
I think the passage wasn't like really hard to understand because it talks about like how the author talks about like, a lot of stories and like here she also mentions like the voices of southern like African storytellers, and then also shows that her stories are like about slavery and like the competition between races in general.
Okay. So well, before I transition Emily into my notes, anybody, is there any questions you have specified to the text that you would like me to address? Okay, bet. So before I get in my notes, I want you, if you can, go grab a pencil and paper. I'm going to provide some information that will be useful for your midterm. I want you guys to write this down. Um, And before we get too far into that, I also want to let's like kind of do a quick rundown of where we came in the semester to get us to where we're at now, right? So we started off investigating and discussing who African people were. From there, we got into this concept or this idea of the maître nefer, right? What I call the radix point of the African oral tradition, which is good speech. Then we investigated pre-colonial West Africa, followed up by the impact of colonialism on West Africa through the work of Malidoma Patrice Somé. We investigated the tension between colonial languages and African languages through Ngugi's Decolonizing the Mind. And then last week, we explored the transatlantic enslavement experience through the poetics of Glissant. So we got an idea of who the people are that we're investigating, some of their experiences, and then now we're going to kind of transition into how they actuated this notion of the oral tradition, first of which being folklore. Okay, so by definition, through the dictionary, folklore is the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. So the orality is fundamental in this notion of folklore. Okay, so it has to be passed down from word of mouth. Okay. Zornel Hurston, who is the author of the text, she states that folklore is the art of the people before they find out that there is any such thing as art. So she situates folklore as a form of art, and I would agree. So earlier in the semester, I gave you your first theoretical framework. That theoretical framework being African American male theory, and which states that African people are resistant and resilient with an innate capacity for brilliance. Right. So that's our first theoretical framework. Your second theoretical framework is titled Funds of Knowledge, and I'll put that in the chat. And that's by one of the individuals who came up with this or coined this term is Tara Yoso, and I'll put that in the chat for you all. Tara Yoso is a sociologist and an educator. And funds of knowledge is not only a theory, but it's also a critique. Funds of knowledge is a response to a notion that's developed by Pierre Bourdieu, who is a French philosopher, which is called cultural capital. Through cultural capital, Bourdieu was trying to address the question, why is it that certain segments of the population excel at education and others don't, right? So Bourdieu asserts the reason why certain segments are able to advance educationally is because of cultural capital. Cultural capital looks like the ability to go to the museums, the ability to go to the opera, the ability to go to the art exhibit, right? Cultural capital is my son plays soccer, my son's teacher's son plays soccer, they're on the same team. So while they're practicing, I could talk with my son's teacher and we could have a conversation and develop a rapport, right? So Bourdieu is saying because of these things, which he calls cultural capital, this is why this segment of the population is able to attain academic success and this segment is not, okay? So Yoso says, hold on, that understanding, this notion of cultural capital, to me, is elitist, right? It takes money to go to the opera. It takes money to go to the museum. It takes money to go to the art exhibit, right? But there's also something that's going on these other populations who don't have the money to obtain the cultural capital. They have this thing what I would call funds of knowledge, right? The knowledge that they pass down from generation to generation that speaks to their cultural uniqueness, that allows them to make sense of their place in the world. Oftentimes, this knowledge goes unrecognized in popular culture or dominant culture, right? He says these funds of knowledge are just as important, in fact, more important than this idea of cultural capital. Funds of knowledge could be abuela's tortilla recipe. Funds of knowledge could be grandma's gumbo recipe, right? For me growing up, my grandma would tell my mom, who my mom would tell me, to be black in this country, you have to be twice as good at everything just to get recognized, right? It's the funds of knowledge that gets passed down. So write this down. Funds of knowledge is knowledge that's passed down from generation to generation that speaks to the cultural uniqueness and provides these cultures an awareness of their place in the world and how to navigate it. And these cultures, or these funds of knowledge, are often go unrecognized in dominant culture. Okay, so that's your second theoretical framework. Now, how this relates to your midterm. You'll have 5 questions, 3 of those you'll have to answer. I'll be expecting you all to use a theoretical framework when answering your question. Now, it may sound like this. I'll pose the question, how old are African people and why is this information important? Using a theoretical framework, your answer may sound like this. Using the theoretical framework, African American male theory, which states African people are resistant and resilient with innate capacity for brilliance, African people can be traced back 8 million years. This becomes important because this situates African people as the original people on the planet, right? So I'm using this framework to work and answer my question. Don't get too stressed out about this now. As we get closer and closer to the midterm, we'll spend more time on these frameworks. I just want you to have this written down and have this in the back of your mind, right? So now you know we have 2 frameworks, one of which being African American male theory, the second of which being funds of knowledge, okay? So the text itself. You read a chapter of the book entitled Of Mules and Men. The author of the text is Zora Neale Hurston. Get that pulled up for you. She is an author, of course, a filmmaker, and most importantly, she's an anthropologist, right? A very central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. She was born in January 7th of 1891. Her probably most famous text is the book Their Eyes Are Watching God. She was born in Alabama, and then eventually her family moved to Florida. And again, as I mentioned, she's an anthropologist, right? Is anyone familiar or can provide us with a definition of what the discipline of anthropology is? Anybody familiar?
Studying cultures.
The studies of cultures, the studies of groups of people, right? So I'm gonna make a claim about anthropology. You could agree, you could disagree, do it what you want. But I state, I argue, I affirm that anthropology is a fundamentally racist discipline. Fundamentally racist. It comes to the fore in the 19th century. So if you hear 19th century, think 1800s. Why do you think I would say that anthropology is a fundamentally racist discipline if it's the study of culture, if it's the study of groups of people?
Um, I think it has to do with Darwinism and how he uses like scientific claims and he hides racist ideas like within science so people will believe it to be real because it's scientific.
Yep. So what Cassandra is pointing us to is the Darwin theory, right, which speaks to this notion of evolution, right? But within this notion of Darwinism is this idea of eugenics. Is anybody familiar with eugenics? Anybody heard of this term before? So eugenics is the science of racial classification based on intelligence, right? So they would say based on the size of the European or the Caucasoid skull, Europeans are the most intelligent, or European descendants are the most intelligent, followed by Asian descendants, followed by indigenous folks, followed by African folks, right? And again, they would use this the size of the head to determine this level of intelligence, right? Pseudoscience. Anthropology assisted in the validation of a lot of that work, right? So they would say, well, this are the claims of intelligence, and look at these anthropological studies that support the inferiority intellectually of Asians, Africans, and indigenous people, right? Think about it. In the 1800s, right, who is doing the anthropological work? What type of individuals are doing this type of work in the 19th century? What's the demographics of anthropologists? What do they look like? Not hard, y'all. What do you think anthropologists look like in the early 1900s or the late 1900s?
They were white.
They were white men specifically, right? So here you have a whole discipline of white men going into areas in Africa, in Asia, in South and Latin America, not speaking the language, not understanding the customs, not understanding the culture, and they're producing knowledge on their limited understanding of a people, right? And they're using this knowledge to signify these people's inferiority, right? So again, fundamentally racist. You don't have to agree with me if you don't want to, but these are some of the facts, right? So in the midst of all this, Zora Neale Hurston arrives on the scene. She's trained under the father of anthropology, Franz Boas. And she seeks to produce this text we know that's called Mules of Men. And what she wants to do is return back to her home in Florida, study the people from her hometown, and produce this text. She wants to study their folklore. She wants to study their parables. She wants to study their traditions and turn the oral into a written, right? So study these oral traditions and place them on paper, to put them on wax, right? I would argue that this book, this collection of ethnographical folklore, stories, and parables is Zora Neale Hurston's middle finger to the science of anthropology, right? This text is an act of subversion against the discipline of anthropology. What does it mean to be subversive? What does it mean to subvert authority? What does that mean?
Like defy?
Yep, to defy, to undermine, right? So this is what Zora Neale Hurston is doing with this text. Because all the other anthropologists of her time are going into foreign areas and authenticating the perceived inferiority of the groups that they're studying with limited information, right? She comes and does the exact opposite. She's not only going to somewhere where she's from, she's going to where she speaks the language. She's going to where she understands the nuances of the culture, right? And she's not going to prove these people's inferiority. She's going to authenticate their humanity. She's going to take these stories that she's heard as a child growing up and make sure that they're forever set in stone on paper, right? Within the text, within the stories that are being told, you're hearing acts of subversion. The story of John, the bear, and the lion, that's a story of subversion, right? The bear gets stabbed up by the man, right? The bear knows that the lion is on its way to cause him a problem. The bear knows he don't want that smoke. So what he's going to do is divert the lion's attention to the man and keep himself safe, right? So subversion is the act of using your intelligence to outsmart those who are in power over you. Subversion is a fundamental element of the Black oral tradition, of the Black literary tradition, of the Black radical tradition. For Africans who experienced enslavement, subversion was necessary, right? In fact, one of the greatest acts of subversion that I've came across is the story of this, and I forget this individual's name, but what he does, he gets this big box, right? And he puts a shipping address on the box to Canada. He climbs in the box and he literally ships himself, mails himself to freedom, right? So this is using your intelligence to outsmart those who are in power over you. This is this notion of subversion. And this is what the parables and the folklores and these stories are dealing with. And this is what her work is doing, right? This is what I call meta theory, which you're talking about within the subject matter of the text, you're doing at a larger scale with the book within itself. So also keep in mind why she goes down there, and they will help you make sense of the reading a little bit more, right? She's going down to Florida. She's hanging out with some folks from this area, and she's listening to them tell stories. She's watching them do their daily activities, and she's just recording notes. And she's documenting everything that happens while she's observing, right? So she's people watching and keeping a journal of the people who she's watching, right? So those are my notes. Let's transition into the fishbowl. Again, you can use my notes, you can use your journal, you can use your breakout room conversation. Is there any volunteers for the fishbowl? Okay, Samantha, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'll call at random then. Heidi, are you prepared to fishbowl?
No.
Andrew, are you prepared to fishbowl?
No, not today.
Okay. Monica, are you prepared to fishbowl?
You said how many times do we have to go, you said?
You have to go twice, and you have one time to pass.
Yeah, because I already went twice.
Okay, so you're good. Thank you for reminding me.
Okay.
Rudy, are you prepared to fishbowl?
No.
Emily, are you prepared to fishbowl?
I went twice already.
Thank you, Emily. I'm gonna mispronounce your name, but is it Pajori? Are you prepared to fishbowl? Potej. Potejois.
Not today.
Not today. All right, thank you, man. You have to kind of remind me on how to pronounce it a few times before I get that right. Okay.
Oh yeah, or you can call me PJ.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get that Potejois because I want to respect the name that you were giving. I'm gonna try it a few times, but if it get too much, then I'll hit you with the PJ.
All right.
Okay,
no problem.
All right. Stephanie, are you prepared to fishbowl? Stephanie Valencia. I'm gonna take that as your pass. Gypsy, are you prepared to fishbowl? So Have y'all read this shit? Did you guys do the reading today, or what's up? Or you guys just want to stay all day? Because I just need two more people to fishbowl. We can keep it pushing. Let's see.
I can fishbowl, but I've gone twice already.
Yeah, so you're good, Cassandra. You did your job. You're good. Monica, have you fishbowled?
Yeah, I said I went twice already.
Thank you, Monica. Yasmin, have you fishbowled? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
I went twice.
You went twice? Okay, thank you, Yasmin. Uh, Christian, have you fishbowled?
I think this is my second time. I could go if you want me to.
Well, I mean, if you went twice, there's no need to go again. But
No, this would be my second one.
okay, so we got you, Christian. We need one more. Alice, have you fishbowled already?
Yes, I fishbowl twice.
Okay, thank you.
I'll go. Sorry, I couldn't hear anything.
All right. So we got Samantha, Christian, and Stephanie. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I can go first.
Okay.
So I just wanted to go back to the reading. I recall somebody saying that the reading kind of focused on multiple topics, and that was kind of confusing for me. I was reading, and as I was reading, I really couldn't come to a conclusion of what the purpose of the reading was. Like in the beginning, it was kind of like the men and animals fighting for strength and dominance, and then it kind of transitioned to manners and like self being selfless and what the definition of respect is, and also then it transitioned to religion and the verses of the Bible. So I understand what my classmate had said about multiple topics being brought up in the reading.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll address that, Samantha, once we get done with the fishbowl, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Next.
I kind of agree with Samantha. I didn't really like see what was the point of this reading. Like I didn't understand like what was a folktale meaning of it, like how it applied to African like cultures, I guess. But I kind of analyzed the text. So basically, like the folktale reinforces the idea that mankind has always dominated natures and animals, and that elders were to be respected, and like they show great knowledge, like how Dad Boykin was talking. He was giving them lessons about like warmth and stuff. And then the folk tales told are used as lessons for like the younger generation, and they often have hidden meanings. So he was talking about like who was the king of the world, and then the preacher came in, and then so the reading shows a conflict between man and nature, and how man is so dominant. And the I guess John was the king of the jungle, and he represents mankind, and the lion represents nature. So basically, it basically means mankind desires to dominate nature as it threatens humanity, and that later on when they were going into the party, I think, they talked about like alligator, like a gator, like be watchful of like the gator. So this like kind of shows a sign that the folktale indicates a meaning for them, that wildlife is danger, and that elders should be respected. And the preacher or sermon that came up, he kind of sent a message through his prayer about how God made men and women equal and side by side, even in nature, with like the lions and stuff. So basically, the reading talks about like respect, equality, and how humans dominate nature. But I didn't really understand like how it applied to African culture that much.
Okay. I'll address that too, Christian. Yeah, good question.
They basically covered what I was gonna say because it confused me as well. But when I was reading it in the beginning, when I was reading the folklore, the way it transitioned into how that I don't know how to explain, like how it was being told, it confused me a bit. Like I wasn't sure what I was reading, and like the language of it, the way the words were, confused me too.
So, for those who were confused, and not just you, Stephanie, just for all of the course who were confused about the language and the way that was written, did you read it out loud or did you read it to yourself?
Well, to myself, but I would try to go back to it and like understand it more.
So again, that's why I was saying before I gave you guys this reading, read it out loud because what you're literally reading are conversations. So again, think about what I was saying in my notes in the sense of her going down to Florida, kicking it with some folks down in Florida, listening to their conversations and literally writing down what she's hearing. And that becomes this book. And this is why you start off hearing a conversation about the bear, the lion, and John, right? And then it goes from that to talking about how the proper way to eat fish. And then it shifts to a sermon. So it's literally like you're going down to Florida, all these folks are on the lake fishing, right? So while they're fishing, they're having a conversation about this folklore. They caught some fish. So now, like, let me, in conversation, I'm going to tell you the proper way to eat fish, right? And then so now, excuse me, everybody's chilling, talking about how to eat fish. They smell the rain in the air, right? It's transitioning to the evening. And they're starting to prepare for the juke, for the juke joint, for the party, right? So she's articulating, she's writing the evening scene, the food that's being prepared, the women getting ready, sitting on their porch because it's hot, right? This is what she's witnessing. And while all this is going on, a traveling preacher arrives on the scene and he gives his sermon. And his sermon is about Adam and Eve and the women and men being equal because he took the rib from the man to make the woman, right? So no, it's not going to make sense if you're looking at this as a sequential story, right? Because that's not what it is. It's literally somebody going to the mall, watching people interact with one another at the mall and writing notes. So if that's what you're doing, you're going to hear a bunch of random stories that won't all mesh together. Does that make a little more sense for you guys? No?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it does.
And this is why in my notes, I spent so much time on anthropology because this is the work that she's doing. She's doing anthropological work, right? So it's not about me coming in and writing a story. She's not writing stories. She's recording the stories that she hears being told. And that's why it's not sequential. That's why it's not a fluid motion of a story. That's why it's choppy. And that's why you have turns and breaks in the story because she's listening to people talk and she's writing down what she hears. And she's writing it down just as she hears it. So she's not going to polish up the language. If she hears them say playing, she's going to write playing, not playing, because that's not what they said, right? So I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, Christian, that's the task. If you try to read it out loud, how they pronounce it, then it's going to sound like a conversation. And it's going to allow it, for me at least, to make more sense. Are there any other questions anyone has about the reading? Anything that still seems unclear? Any questions about our theoretical framework? Okay. So this week's reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the subject matter itself was too dense. It was too heavy or theoretical, but the way that it was written made it kind of difficult, right? This is my assumption. Next week's reading is going to be the opposite. The way that this is written is very clear. It's very straightforward. It's magnificently written. It's beautifully written. But the subject matter is dense. It's uncomfortable. And I would even say trigger warning. There's going to be some themes in here that's going to make you extremely uncomfortable. But we're adults. We can deal with it. Let me point out the reading for next week. So we're transitioning into James Baldwin. Which is one of my favorite authors of all time. James Baldwin and Octavia Butler are my favorite authors. But Serena, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Would you say every reading that we do contains a theoretical framework?
This is how I'll answer this question, Serena. No, but you can find a theoretical framework in it, right? So everything that you read, you could either put in the category of African American male theory, or you could place in the category of funds of knowledge. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's not like they're writing from this framework, but you could place their work within that framework. So for next week, we'll be reading these 3 PDFs by James Baldwin. It's one complete story, but I had to break it up in 3. So you only need one journal entry, but make sure you read all 3 PDFs or it will not make sense. So this week is folklore. Next week is a story. The week after that will be a letter. So this week will be James Baldwin's Going to Meet the Man. Again, magnificently written, beautifully articulated, but it's heavy. It's emotionally heavy. And you're gonna feel uncomfortable, but it's okay. We'll work our way through it. So just to kind of give you an idea, because I mentioned the midterm to kind of take off some angst for you guys. What we'll be looking at will be Baldwin next week, Baldwin after that. We'll do a midterm review the following week, and then I'll assign the midterm after that. So that's about the time that you guys can anticipate your midterm.